edge. And one of the things that is done to a 4-year-old child who's sexually molested by someone who should be taking care of them is that the problem of the evil in the human heart is laid at their feet when they're 4. Now, how in the world are you going to deal with that? And what that does just fragments and shatters people. And, maybe by the time they're 30, maybe they're sophisticated enough to spend a whole year thinking that through and coming up with some formulation about, what would you say, the theological and psychological nature of malevolence itself, and they can put it into context and move on, but it's not an easy matter. Well, one of the things I did with people in my practice who had post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes people who were betrayed and tortured, sometimes people who betrayed themselves, is I'd have them read accounts of great evils. So, for example, there's a book called Ordinary Men, brutal book, and it details, it's really quite a singular book, it details out the adventures of this group of policemen who were middle-aged in Nazi Germany. And middle-aged is important because they grew up before the Nazi propaganda. If you grew up under the Nazi propaganda and you became a Nazi, it's like, well, not that that's forgivable, but it's more understandable, right? Because that's all you knew. But if you're like 40 when Hitler comes to power, you don't have that as an excuse. And so all these policemen in this battalion were middle-aged guys, and they're all just ordinary policemen going about their ordinary policing work in Germany. And then they were shipped as a battalion to Poland when the Germans marched through, and they were basically shanghaied into military service. Okay, so now there's a war going on, and the Germans have been told that the reason for the war is the international conspiracy of the evil Jews, and the policemen are told that there's a lot of Jewish people in Poland and that it's necessary for them to keep the peace and keep the homeland safe to start to act against the Jews. And this is a very interesting book because the commander of this battalion was, by all appearances, quite a compassionate and reasonable person. And he told all his policemen at the beginning of the action that if they wanted to leave Poland and go back to Germany and not participate in what was to come, that they could, and that there would be no repercussions. And some of them did, and there were no repercussions. And by the way, although everyone thinks that if you didn't abide by the dictatorial dictates of the totalitarian state of Nazi Germany that you were going to be severely punished, there's not very much evidence for that. People seem to go along with it voluntarily for the most part, and that was exemplified in this battalion. Well, the first thing these men were called upon to do. Now, you might imagine, too, you're in that situation. Now, you're out there with all these men you've worked with for a long period of time, and your commander is saying, look, we're in a war and there's going to be some difficult things you have to do, and maybe you don't want to leave all the terrible, difficult things to your comrade here. Maybe you want to shoulder your fair share of the catastrophe. And so the people who left, and some of them did, had to do that despite the fact that in some real sense they felt they were betraying their fellow officers by leaving them with the dirty work. Now, at the beginning, they didn't exactly know what the dirty work was going to be, but I'm telling you this so you can see how the stage might be set for someone's participation. Could easily be that it was the more loyal policeman who stayed, right? And you generally think that loyalty is an admirable trait, and that's one of the terrible things about participating in great acts of evil is you can be pulled into them by your virtues, right? So that's a terrifying. Anyways, they started, I won't get this exactly right, but I get the gist of it. I think they started out by rounding up Jewish men who were of military age and shipping them off to God only knows where, because they didn't really know where they were ending up at that point. But they ended up, step by step, taking naked, pregnant women out into the fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And this wasn't a pleasant initiation experience for these men, right? Most of them developed alcoholism. They were traumatized like mad for doing this, but one bloody step at a time, they went along with it until they turned into, the absolute worst murderers, and you can be sure that at some point, some of them started to enjoy it, right? And then you think, well, what does that have to do with you? And that's a good question. What it has to do with you is that if you were there, that's probably what you would have done. Right, and you think, no, because you talk to them about this, you talk to people about this, about Nazi Germany, and they always think they're Oskar Schindler, they're the people who would have hid the Jews in the attic. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. That was pretty damn rare behavior. And if you look at the avidity with which everyone went along with the totalitarian restrictions around COVID, how many people positively enjoyed that, that put paid to any simple notion that we've learned something from what happened 80 years ago. So, and I would say too, and this is something I learned from Jung, is that if you are really concerned about the fact that such things happen, and you should be, because they might happen again, and at any moment, you should take whatever steps are necessary to ensure that you wouldn't be a participant. And the first thing you have to do is to understand that you probably would be. And since that's the case, there might be some alterations that have to be made to your character that are pretty damn deep. And so one of the things you do to that is like, well, in which handbasket would you ride to go to which particular hell, and what are you doing to increase that probability? And that's a very good thing to meditate on. That's also part of the incorporation of the shadow from the Jungian perspective. You can find out some interesting things about yourself too, because if you're more horrible than you think, which is highly probable, you also might be a more difficult creature to contend with than you might think, and lots of times people don't really know how to stand up for themselves. And this is also part of getting Satan behind you, so to speak, is that if you can get that part of your personality that might make itself manifest in vengefulness and resentment, if you can integrate that and use it as something like what the charismatic power of anger at your fingertips, that makes you very difficult to stop. Right? Because, you'll be facing people who put out a hand to stop you, and often that'll stop people cold. But if you have that demented and bent spirit organized properly in front of you, that's not going to slow you down a bit. Right? And that's part of the utility of actually being dangerous. And you're not going to be dangerous till you know you can be. And if you know you can be, well, then you can integrate that. Right? And then you're formidable instead of dangerous, and that's a kind of dangerousness too. But also understanding that can make you treat yourself with a bit more respect. And that respect isn't exactly, let's say, self-esteem. It's more like the respect you might have for a stick of dynamite. It's like, be careful, because you don't know what you're capable of. Right? So like walk carefully, and don't be thinking that your minor league foolishnesses are, what would you say, trivial. They're not trivial. What did Dostoevsky say? Solzhenitsyn said, one man who stops lying can bring down a totalitarian state. So then if you happen to inhabit a totalitarian state, maybe that's the job you hate, you might ask yourself, just how much lying are you doing to contribute to that? And if everything around you is turning into a totalitarian state, you might ask yourself the same question, right? Because maybe if you were a little straighter, things around you wouldn't be quite so crooked. And really, I do believe that that is the case, and that is the responsibility that rests on every person's shoulders. We wouldn't believe that we are sovereign citizens with intrinsic worth if we weren't charged with that responsibility. And I don't really understand how everyone can be charged with that responsibility, but I do understand that in a totalitarian state, everyone lies about everything all the time, right? And so then you have to ask yourself, well, if you refuse to participate, just exactly how much would that shake things up? And Solzhenitsyn's conclusion was, well, they'll probably kill you. And maybe that's because you started telling the truth a little late, right? But I don't know, maybe it's better to risk death than to live in hell. It's something to think about, that's for sure. So this has to do with seriousness, is that one of the things that can make you serious is to really contemplate just how bent and twisted you could become if you allowed yourself to revel in that, let's say. I'll give you another example of that. So in the story of Cain and Able is a story of sacrifice, right? So it's the story that's placed at the beginning of human history. So you could think about it as a story that lays out two broad patterns of adaptation. There's that pattern of Abel, and Abel makes the proper sacrifices, right? And so what does that mean? Well, it means something like he makes the sacrifices that are pleasing to God. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, what does it mean to make the proper sacrifices? It's like, this. You know perfectly well when you're giving your all to an enterprise and when you're not. And you know perfectly well that the probability that you'll succeed is proportionate to the amount of commitment you have to the enterprise, right? Like maybe you're like 60% in, you're sort of mucking about and you're trying to get away with things, and you're a little late to work and you don't do as much of a job as you could and you slough off, and well, you're not going to be that successful, and you know that, and you probably call yourself out on that, and maybe you've hidden that so much in lies that you've forgotten that you should, and you're all cynical about capitalism so that you can be useless with a good conscience. But and you know this, and you know too that when you look back at your life and you're pleased with what you've done, you'll be pleased because you really put yourself into something, and the consequence of that was that something positive emerged as a consequence, right? And maybe that's some sort of internal transformation or some sort of material gain or some sort of social gain, like a genuine one. And those are the things that put you firmly on your feet. And Abel is a representation of the pattern of proper sacrifice. And Cain, he makes second-rate sacrifices. And that story doesn't really say why, and I think the reason for that is you have your own reasons for making second-rate sacrifices, and so do you, and the reasons aren't going to be the same. So you don't want to specify that too tightly. You want to leave it loose. It's like, I don't know why you're failing voluntarily. That's sort of in your domain to determine, but the probability that it's the case is very high. And why might you do that? And the answer has something to do with pride. I mean, when a child attempts to pull the wool over the eyes of his father, he does that because he assumes that his father's too blind and stupid to notice. And that's a form of arrogance. And there's an even deeper arrogance that's associated with it, which is that you're acting out the belief that you can bend and twist the fabric of reality to benefit you unfairly, and that there will be no consequences to that. And that's just, that's not a wise decision. It's like, who the hell do you think you are? You really think you can twist what's real and not have it snap back and take you out. It's like, that's not a wise conclusion to draw from your experience. Now, it's complicated because sometimes you can do that for a short period of time and it works, right? And sometimes you can do it for a short-term period of time and it works. And when it snaps back, you can be so blind that you don't draw the connection. Right? One of the things you do in therapy is quite painful. And you do this with deep conversations too, is, if someone's life has taken a vicious turn, you sort of unwind it back to the origin point of that turn, and you generally find that someone made a decision that they knew was an inappropriate decision. And that put them on the wrong path, right? And they had their reasons for it, and then they forget, because you don't remember why the hell you did something 5 years ago. It might take a lot of digging to recreate that state of mind and to remember the decision. But the probability that you knew it was a bad idea when you embarked on it is extremely high. And that's a painful part of self-realization, because you also have to then come to terms with the fact that if you took an inappropriate turn 5 years ago, you've now spent 5 years, erecting the wrong Tower of Babel. That's a good way of thinking about it. So, all right, so you sit for 15 minutes and you develop a little vision of just exactly how dismal your bloody life could be if you kept doing all the stupid things you're doing and you did them better. And that's useful. And you want to do it to the point where you think, yeah, I don't think I'm going to go there. And so then when you're tempted, you see, then in the future, when you're tempted to take a step in that direction, you can conjure up that fantasy and you can think, yeah, nah, maybe not, maybe not. And maybe fear isn't